All right, hello everybody and welcome to our webinar, U.S. Navy Integrates Spring Applications with Flying Colors thanks to Web CMS. We appreciate your patience as we're starting just a couple minutes late due to a few little technical quirks, but we're glad you could join us today. My name is Sean McMains and I'm the sales engineer for Magnolia Americas. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what we'll be covering in this webinar, together with a few housekeeping items. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes. And the subject for today's presentation is how Campbell-Ewald used Magnolia CMS to relaunch the U.S. Navy's recruitment website, Navy.com, with a focus on how they were able to effectively use Blossom, which is Magnolia's Spring integration module, to integrate the Navy's existing Spring applications. This was a challenging and exciting project from the start, and Matt will take us through it in some detail during his presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a few housekeeping items first. All attendees in the conference are muted right now. However, this does not mean that you can't ask questions. Please do feel free to submit any questions you have throughout the webinar using your GoToWebinar control panel. And we'll do our best to address them all during the Q&A session toward the end of the webinar. Now, if you don't see the control panel, you can go to your window menu and choose the GoToWebinar control panel, and that should make it visible for you. If we're unable to answer all of your questions, or if you request a personal follow-up, then we will contact you directly after the webinar's conclusion. Now, a few days after the webinar, we'll also be posting a video recording of the presentation on the Magnolia website, as well as the slides. You'll get an email with links to all this material, so don't feel like you have to take notes frantically over the course of the thing. Following the webinar, you should feel free to contact the presenters directly using the email addresses or contact information we've provided at the end of the webinar. And if you want to tweet about the webinar, we ask that you would include the hashtag Magnolia CMS. Other related hashtags you might also choose to use are Campbell-Ewald, Spring Framework, Spring MVC, and U.S. Navy. Now let's go ahead and do some introductions. First off, our primary presenter today is Matt Dertinger. Matt is the solutions architect at Campbell-Ewald, which is the Navy's interactive agency, and he's going to be bringing us the majority of our content today. Tobias Mattsson is a senior software engineer at Magnolia, and he is the big brain responsible for the development of the Blossom module, which, as I mentioned, is our Spring integration framework. And lastly, my name is Sean McMains. I'm a sales engineer for Magnolia as well. Now, Campbell-Ewald, with whom we're working today, is a digital agency and one of Magnolia's partner organizations. They have extensive Magnolia expertise, and they've done many Magnolia implementations for a variety of clients, including GM, Kaiser Permanente, and the U.S. Postal Service. We're really excited to be able to work with them today on this presentation. Magnolia, of course, is responsible for the Magnolia Content Management System, which is a standards-based, open-source Java language web CMS. Our client list is extensive, and it includes Sony, Deloitte, Airbus, and JBoss, among others. So with all that said, without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Matt Dertinger. Take it away, Matt.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. First off, I'd like to cover some of the agenda items for today's webinar. First, we're going to give an overview of the Blossom module, what it is, and advantages of using it. Next, we'll look at some Navy use cases. We'll show some examples and talk about the problems that Blossom solved for us. Then we'll go in depth into the implementation details. We'll look at the source code and walk step by step through the setup and development of a particular Navy application component that leverages Spring and Blossom. We'll spend about 20 minutes or so on this. Finally, we'll try to answer any questions that you posted to us. So first off, we'll talk about Blossom. We'll give a little overview, and I'll turn it over to Tobias.
Thank you, Matt. This is a quote from my blog that summarizes the idea I had that sparked me to write Blossom. Like Matt, I worked for a company that was focusing on Spring development, and when we needed a CMS, we looked for one that would let us use all that experience and have the same programming model. We also had a large backend based on Spring that we needed to integrate with, so using Spring also in the CMS would really be great and help us a lot. We looked around in the market and we could not find one that would do this, so we chose Magnolia for its technical maturity, and then we did the Spring integration ourselves. The result of this was the Blossom module, and it lets you build content-rich websites simply by writing Spring Web MVC controllers, and then you can compose your pages with them. And really everything is centered on controllers with Blossom, from the logic behind the page to how it's authored by content editors. The idea is that you just add these annotations and instantly you can snap them with your controllers right into your pages as you like. This means that you can leverage your skills in Spring and take the application you already have and run it in Magnolia. The dialogues that your content editors interacts with are built by code, and you write that code in annotated methods on your controllers. So everything is in one place. The virtual URI mappings is a URL rewriting mechanism that's also configured using annotations. And pre-execution is a way of handling an action before the page is rendered, kind of what you have in a portal server, where a request is directed at just one part of the page. And of course, as you'd expect, the integration gives you Spring's support for dependency injection and aspect-oriented programming. These days I work for Magnolia, where I maintain the module and offer support for it when needed. And of course, it's open source and free to use. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Tobias. Now we'll dive into some Navy use cases where we're using Blossom. A little bit about the Navy. It's an official recruitment website for the U.S. Navy. We redesigned it in 2010 and moved to Magnolia CMS. All the application integration for subscription services, the CRUD functionality, and user space applications were all done using Spring and Blossom. A little bit of architectural overview. We decided to separate a lot of the business components into a separate web app, which is a Grails app, which houses all of our web servers, and it lets us do things like recruiter locator, lookups, and etc. For this, we decided to add in some REST easy to our Spring controllers, and that just provided a nice JAX-RS client for us. The reason for REST easy was it aligned well with the Magnolia CMS roadmap and allowed our business components to be loosely coupled to the CMS. This had a practical advantage that to us because we needed to start building our application components prior to actually finalizing the selection of our CMS. So here's some examples of where we're using Blossom. We have a request more information form, which is basically our lead forms for all of our potential recruits. Find a recruiter lets site visitors find the nearest recruiter based on their zip code. We have a subscriber service, which allows them to subscribe to newsletters. We have a LifeOps, which is a user app, which allows them to see where they fit into the Navy. We'll talk about this extensively. Basically, it's a profile test. And then we have a reserve pay calculator, which allows currently serving and prior service personnel to see what their annual drill pay and training pay would be based on their rate, rank, and monthly or years of service. And we have a training locations map also on NavyReserve.com, which shows the training locations closest to them. And finally, we have a poll, which just takes, we have a monthly poll on the site, which just takes some questions that we serve up to them every so often and gives us a better idea of how we're doing. So first off, the request more info form. It's a basic lead form, contact information. We'll have some demographic information here, which allows them to actually select their interest area, and then based on those selections, we serve up the questions that relate to that particular interest area. This allows us to target our responses to them based on what their interest is and offer up scholarship information and other services to them based on what their interest, the interest they selected. So all these interest categories have their own subgroup items, which basically allow us to do like eligibility requirements and matching them to particular scholarship programs, for example. Next up, we can look at the training locations map. And here we have all the training locations that the Navy Reserve has. And so if you're thinking about joining the reserve, you can choose the state that you reside in, for instance, and see the training locations that you may be attending. All this information here is editable by the content editors. It actually uses the data module, and all the information is stored in the data repository that Magnolia offers. This really helps us with updating these locations and keeps everything nice and clean, and also allows us to not really have to touch the application components for simple content updates. Next up, also on reserve.com, is our reserve pay calculator. It allows you to, like I said, select a pay grade and your years of service, and it calculates the result for you based on that. So based, again, years of service, and we also have one here for officer pay grades. So this gives them an idea of what they can actually expect when they join the reserve. Again, all this information here is editable by the content authors and is stored in the data repository, which is really a nice module if you haven't checked it out yet. Great way to show or store hierarchical data. Lastly, well, not lastly, but next, we have a Find a Recruiter app, which finds the nearest enlisted and officer recruiter locations based on their postal code. We'll collect and validate the input, and then we actually call the Navy Web Service using REST Easy and display the results back. So let's just quickly look at that. So we have a zip code, and we see here we have our enlisted location and our officer recruiter location. And then the information is also displayed down here. So next up is the application component that we're going to be talking the majority about today. It's LifeOps, and it's a personality profile test that helps potential recruits plan their future. We chose to implement it with a wizard type interface just to make it easy for users to select what they want in the 3 different areas and see the results. The 3 different areas are activities, interests, and careers, and basically they choose the options from each checkbox group there that they think they would like, and based on that we map it to 6 different profile types, or personality profile types, and display some information about those profile types and careers in the Navy that relate to those. So let's go ahead and take a look. So here's we just have an overview page about what LifeOps is and what they'll learn. And a little video here that explains a little bit better.
Your life and even your career can resemble almost any mission in the Navy. Preparation and planning are essential for successful mission. To attain your final objective, you must identify your strengths. Optimize these strengths to work in your favor. Make a plan.
And make the escalation coordinates confirmed.
And finally, excel. It's this type of awareness and preparation that will help you succeed in everything you do, from doing your homework to starting and growing your career, to even making your daily activities more productive. That's why we've created LifeOps. You tell us what you do and don't like to do and what you're passionate about, and LifeOps will help uncover your hidden skills and talents and show you how you can use them to benefit your career and life in the Navy.
Having these experiences kind of set me a bit apart. They set me up for future success.
What skills and talents have you been waiting to unleash upon the world?
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Here we have the LifeOps form. The content that you see over here is all editable by the content editor, and we'll see exactly how we enabled that within this particular page component. So first off, we look here and we validate the least one option from each one of the categories is selected. So let's go ahead and select some of these guys. Just choosing what I'm interested in. And then our interests, we'll select some interests. I hate programming websites, but I'll select it anyways. And just kidding. Anyways, and then our careers. So we'll select some careers. And now we have our results. The highest result, we have a video here that shows them exactly what that profile is in depth. And then we have the overall scores are all mapped graphically here for them. Within each one of these panes, we use the standard templating kit for all the content. So our Blossom paragraph is really, and controller is just really responsible for displaying back this accordion and sorting it in descending order based on the results. So since I just mentioned the standard templating kit, I'll turn it over to Sean, and he'll discuss what the standard template kit is and why it's so cool.
Great. Thanks a lot, Matt. So the STK, or as we abbreviate Standard Templating Kit, it's a website framework that we ship with Magnolia. It can be used as is out of the box, or it can have a custom style applied to the default templates we include, or it can be extended and customized in a variety of other ways. Now, we built it on the best practices we've identified over years of building websites, providing a variety of functionality for publishing and aggregating articles, events, documents, news, and other types of data. Having all of this functionality pre-built makes prototyping a website extremely quick, since so many common use cases are already covered. Now, the SDK's modular architecture means you can use everything that meets your needs, ignore the stuff that doesn't, and easily integrate any new functionality you build on top of it. And finally, the SDK is standards compliant. If you use the templates we've provided, you don't need to worry about validating and testing your pages across a whole variety of browsers because we've already done that work for you. So in our experience, starting with a demo site will often get clients about 10% of the way toward having a custom website that does what they want. A Kickstart package might include some more functionality and get folks a bit farther. But by building on the SDK, we're able to give our clients much more of a head start, often finding that the provided components cover about 80% of the needs for a fully customized site. So you can see the SDK is a super valuable tool and a large part of the value that Magnolia provides to our clients. And that's all I have to say about the SDK. So back to you, Matt.
Thanks, John. Okay, so as promised, we'll go and look at how we build live apps. We'll go through a step-by-step walkthrough of exactly what you'll need to do to get something like this working. So first off, we'll do getting started. For Blossom, there's a little bit of configuration, so you'll need to add a context listener to your web deployment descriptor. You just want to make sure that that comes before any other listeners that you have defined. Next, you'll create a custom Spring application module for all your application components. The easiest way to do that is through an archetype that Magnolia provides. And you have your module class extend Blossom module support and implement the start and stop methods. Each module in Magnolia has a module class, which implements the start and stop methods of the module lifecycle. So in the case of Blossom, we start and stop Spring. So you'll see here we've called to our web application context, which we have on class path as application context.xml, and we initialize the Blossom dispatcher servlet, which is another Spring bean. So let's go ahead and look at that. So first we'll create our Spring Bean config file, and we'll call it application context.xml. This is really simple file, and you never really need to touch it again. So that's it. Next up is our Spring Bean config file called blossomservlet.xml, and this is where we're going to put all of our Spring MVC information. The first thing you'll see here is the component scan. Since it's all annotation based, we're able to scan our modules based on our module's base package name, and that goes through, grabs all of the classes that are annotated with the Blossom paragraph or template, dialog factory, or virtual UI mapping annotations, and loads those. So just make sure you can pretty much copy and paste that last part. You just want to make sure that you change your base package to reflect your package name. Next, this should seem pretty familiar. All of the handler mappings for Blossom, or for Spring. The only thing different from the normal Spring MVC setup is we wrap the Spring handler mappings inside the Blossom handler mapping bean. And finally, with our Spring Bean config, we have our view resolvers. And Magnolia supports both FreeMarker and JSP. Here we chose to implement with the FreeMarker templates, so it kind of easier to integrate in with the SDK, and also allows us to do activations without having to deploy the entire module for like simple template updates, for instance. FreeMarker's really been nice to work with. Nice clean separation between the view and any kind of business logic. So let's look at the LifeOps model. For the LifeOps model, we chose to use the Bean Validation API, which is JSR 303. And this allows us to define constraints on all of our model properties using annotations. So here we've defined, we're showing 2 of the 6 profile types that are available within LifeOps, and we're specifying that they can't be null, and their value has to be between 0 and 18. For this to work, we need to add a little bit something more to our Blossom Servlet XML. So we'll go ahead and look at that in our IDE. So here's our Blossom Servlet in its complete form. So we've added in here our web binding initializer, which references our validator. And then Spring provides a local validator factory bean, which implements the JSR 303 bean validation API spec. So with that done, we're done with our Blossom Servlet config file. And we've also added some validation to our model. So this is just here for your reference if you want to come back to it. Next thing in our Lightbox model is our constructors. Basically, we have two constructors for our Lightbox model. One takes the 6 different profile types and sets their properties. The other one creates a Lightbox using some transient values, which are our 3 checkbox groups: activities, interests, and careers. So we take those in and we return the results based on, or we set the 6 different profile types based on the checkbox groups coming in. So since the activities, interests, and careers are transient values, we need a way to validate those. So we've created a Spring Validator class, which allows us to basically validate those transient values as they come in. So here we're just checking to make sure that at least one item from each of the 3 categories has been chosen. Next, we'll look at the Lightbox controller. And this is really where Blossom comes into play. Excuse me. Everything's pretty much standard Spring MVC here again. The only thing we've added are some annotations to allow our content editors access to add content into our paragraph. So we've added an annotation here for annotation, and we give it a paragraph description, which is just a nice little hint that will show up in our dialogues that the content editors will use. The request mapping, by convention, Blossom will use the request mapping to name the actual paragraph, so you can reference it within, for instance, your standard template kit template definition. So by convention, again, it's whatever path that is with the slashes removed from the beginning and underscores for any slashes that are in between that path. So we'll go ahead and we'll look at how that mapping, we can assign this paragraph to one of our templates. So here's our standard template config menu, and we'll go into template defs. And we have our Lightbox results, for instance, and it has some paragraphs in its main area. And one of those happens to be our STK Lightbox results paragraph, which we've named here, or referenced here with the Lightbox, which is defined in our Blossom controller. So now if we go to our actual test page here, we can see that our Lightbox form is in the dialog presented to the content editor, and what that paragraph is used for. So let's go ahead and do that. And now we have a dialog here which has some fields for us, for the content editor to actually throw in some content. And we'll stop there for a second. Okay, so the next method that we have here is for handling post requests. And here we've added the valid annotation from the Spring support for the Bean validation API, so that any model coming in validates against that, or any posts that come in validate against that model. We also have the transient values, so we'll call our LifeOps validator and validate those transient values. If any errors are found, we'll stick those back into the LifeOps model and then return to the forms path. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and create a new LifeOps model with the transient values that were passed in, and then we'll redirect to a location with using the LifeOps properties: advisor, doer, innovator, and persuader, planner, and problem solver. And we did this instead of passing these as query parameters, since we decided it creates a cleaner URL, and Blossom also provides a nice URI mapper annotation, which we can use. This allows for easier bookmarking and sharing by the user, and we can also take advantage of Magnolia's caching feature. Since there's only so many different combinations, this makes sense. By default, Magnolia won't cache anything with a query string, which makes sense for dynamic requests. And our final method is for GET requests that are for returning users or people who have shared a bookmark. This just takes in those 6 different profile types and displays the results. So that way users don't have to go through the whole test again. And this also relies on the virtual UI mapping. Lastly, in our controller, we are able to define a tab factory, which allows us to actually create the dialog component that you saw when we started building out a LifeOps form. So this just, we're able to create different edit dialog controls. For instance, here we've just created 3 text fields, and then we've also added a FCK editor for our results page. Any dialog controls that are available within Magnolia are available within Blossom, so you can take advantage of all those dialog controls. So let's go back and see exactly how our editors can add some instructional text to each one of the tabs. So again, we'll just create this, and then we'll provide some text here for each one of our, for some instructional copy. And since this is the form page, we don't have to worry about the results text right now, so we'll just save that. And now we have our form in place. And this is the text that we just entered. So let's go ahead and take our test. Again, I'm just kind of selecting some options randomly. Get a nice assortment, and next. Okay, so our results screen here, you'll see we've already added in our results intro text in our FCK editor. But then the rest of our accordion here is all empty. So this allows us to really take advantage of the SDK and separating our content from any of our controller logic. So the controller, in this case, is just used to collect and then sort the results panes based on, in descending order based on how they scored in each one of the profile types. So within each one of these panes, we have our just standard templating kit paragraphs that they can use to add in some content within there. So we have some innovator copy. And then we'll go ahead and we'll create our teaser group. And then we can add our teaser paragraphs to that teaser group. So we'll go ahead and link these to some of our career pages. And there we go. We have two columns here. So when we go to look at our results view, we will look at exactly how we assign the content to a particular pane. So one thing to notice here is we need to create a virtual UI mapping for that URL to work. So we created a class just annotated with the virtual UI mapper and gave it a regular expression which basically matches against any URLs with between 0 and 18 for each one of the profile scores. And then we just forward that onto our results page. So let's go ahead and look at the Lighthouse form view. Basically, it's one form with 3 field sets, one field set for each transient property in our model, activities, interests, and careers. Let's go back to our IDE. And here's our form model class, or form view. And we see here we're just assigning some variables to activities text, interest text, and careers text, which just grabs that content from our dialog that we set up. When you want to retrieve content in Magnolia, you just do content dot whatever the name you gave to your dialog control. One thing I just commented out here, we don't use it for this particular paragraph, but if you want to use pre-execution, you just want to add in a hidden field, which Blossom provides a tag for. So it basically creates a unique identifier for that paragraph request. Next, we have our error messages. So we'll just display whatever error messages, if there are any, in our view. And then we have our first field set. Here's where we populate our activities text. Then we have our checkbox group for activities. Again, same type of thing for interests, the checkbox group for the interests. And then finally, our careers with the checkbox group for the careers. So now on to the results pane, or panel, or view, sorry. Here is an example. We just want to create a results sequence of maps and populate the scores with our model properties that were returned from our controller. So we have a couple of properties here, name and label. Name we'll use to actually name a few of our content nodes to store the individual items, and the label is basically used just in the view for presentation purposes. And then finally, the score is populated from our LifeOps model. Magnolia Standard Template Kit offers a accordion paragraph, so we've repurposed that here, made a few changes to it, so we can actually sort by the score in descending order and then display the results. So we'll also create some content node collections. So in this case, we have our score width, which is just the result, the score times 11%, and we'll use that to create the green bars that you saw there. And then we'll have our content collection text and our content collection extras. Since we have 2 columns there in each one of the panes, we just name these with the result name that we're looping through and plus text. And same thing with the extras. We just concatenate it with extras. And then you see in the content collection or the content node iterator, we're just looping through those collections and displaying them. And then we have a new bar to actually create those content items. Here we've just defined STK text image and STK teaser group as our allowable paragraphs, both of which are in the standard template kit. So let's go ahead and take a look at that in the IDE so you can get a better idea. So here's our scores. Again, we're concerned about the highest result. Just give us access to which video to display based on what they've answered. And we have our results text, which we've populated from our dialog. And then we have our accordion, which we'll loop through. And here's our content collection text and our content collection extras. Again, just going back to here, this is our content collection text, and then this would be our content collection extras. So we have 2 separate collections of content nodes. And that's it. And now I'll go to your questions.
All right, great stuff, Matt. We've got a couple of questions in from the audience. The first one, I think you touched on a little bit already, but if you could just reiterate, are you able to modify the content on the Spring MVC page via the Magnolia console?
If I understand the question right, yes. Basically, are you asking about how you edit the paragraphs content, or?
I think that's what the questioner is getting at there.
Then yes, and you do that via the dialog factory or the tab factory in the case of the paragraph.
Okay, good.
So you can just add in the properties that you want there.
Okay.
For the content editors to actually edit. Obviously, some properties or some content you might not want them to edit that are related to the particular application. For instance, are the actual form properties for the different activities and interests, things like that.
Great, thank you. The next one we've got is it possible to also use other Spring modules like Spring Security and Spring Webflow with Magnolia?
Definitely. You can. There's actually some Webflow examples on the Magnolia documentation site, which there's some links to at the end of this presentation. And there's also some helpful information on the Spring forums with some discussion, or sorry, not the Spring forums, the Magnolia forums with some discussions about implementing Spring Security. but I'll let Tobias that a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, this is quite a common case for us. We see people using Spring Security for implementing secure parts of their websites where people can log in and check their order statuses and so on. And for many shopping sites and e-commerce sites, we see Spring Webflow being used for booking flows and purchase flows. So it's quite common.
Great. Well, another question from the audience is, why did you choose Magnolia versus Drupal, or another open source option that's being used by the government a lot? And what does Magnolia offer that Drupal doesn't?
We evaluated a lot of different solutions. The thing that Magnolia offered over many of them was they actually thought about application integration in the case of different open source frameworks. So it was pretty easy to implement, especially when you have a helpful module like Blossom. The other thing was the user interface for the actual content editors to edit the content was extremely simple and intuitive. So that really just gave us a huge head start. And then the standard templating kit was just a complete bonus to actually get us up and running real fast.
Great, good information. Next up, we've got a few more questions from the audience. Can you access Magnolia nodes if you have your REST web services in a different web project?
I believe yes, but I think it's also going to be much easier in the next version of Magnolia. I think there's also, I'll let Tobias explain a little bit more about the current implementations of that and what you can see, what you can look forward to in the future.
Yeah, yeah. So what's happening in the next version of Magnolia is we're switching out the content API, as we like to call it, which is an abstraction layer on top of the JCR repository. And instead, we are recommending that you access the JCR directly. To answer the question, the design of the JCR, or more specifically of Jackrabbit, means that you should access the data from one running JVM. So in this case, you would need to have, inside Magnolia, you would have to have your REST web services and then access those services from your other web project, or in some other way via remoting access the data.
And one of the things Matt alluded to is that the upcoming Magnolia 4.5 is also slated to include a suite of REST web services from there too. So it'll become easier with Magnolia 4.5 to use REST to access content that's stored in Magnolia. The next question we had up is, where is the database integration? The viewer didn't see it in the controller, or was it not there? Is there another way that you do database integration?
Well, in our case, there's two different database implementations. One database is backing the web service, which is a separate web app. And then there's the Magnolia CMS database used for Magnolia content. So I don't know if that helps answer your question. Basically, any of our business components that save to the database do so via the that are taking in user content. For instance, the CRUD applications are doing so through the web service.
Great, good information. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our questions and also to the end of the webinar. So thank you very much to Matt and Tobias for their time and their willingness to share their information and experiences. Also, thanks to everybody who came and attended. We're really glad you could join us and hope the session was helpful for you. Within the next few days, we'll be emailing you links to the webinar recording and slides. The slides will also include links to a variety of web pages for additional information on the topics that we've covered here today. Also, you should feel free to contact any of us for more information or if we can be of additional assistance. So thank you all again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.